It all happened on an ordinary morning, one of those when the office routine seems to follow a well-rehearsed rhythm. The entire team was gathered in the meeting room for the final preparations for an important presentation. A potential major client was due in a few minutes, and the mood was one of anticipation. I was prepared, or at least I believed I was. I had studied the company's profile, reviewed the proposals, and anticipated objections. I was confident, ready to contribute. It was in this scenario that my boss, in front of everyone, interrupted my speech with a short, direct and embarrassing sentence. "You're not ready for the meeting." The silence that followed was deafening. Eyes averted. Some stared at the floor, others stared at me with pity, perhaps discomfort. My face burned. I felt the blow to my self-esteem immediately, not just from the criticism, but from the way it was delivered, in public, without warning, and without giving me a chance to respond. At that moment, I had two clear choices. The first was to accept that statement as truth and back down, as they might have expected. The second was to take a deep breath, swallow my pride, and decide that, even with my boss's trust shaken, I could show my worth not with defensive words, but with action and results. And it was this choice that defined everything that would come next. Hearing that phrase, "You're not ready for the meeting," was like being doused with cold water on a battlefield. The instant after the statement, my heart raced, adrenaline coursed through me, and for a few seconds, my mind froze. It was as if my very presence there had been invalidated with a single sentence. I doubted myself. I doubted my preparedness, my usefulness on the team, even the respect my colleagues had for me. The greatest pain, however, wasn't the internal doubt. It was the fact that it was said in front of everyone. Public humiliation transforms a common criticism into something much more corrosive. The remark stopped being just about my supposed lack of preparation. It became a verdict, a public disappointment. I wondered if others also thought I wasn't ready. If now everyone would see me as a burden, as someone who isn't quite up to par. Inside, the initial impulse was to retreat, to shut up and let someone else take my place. But as the minutes passed, and I remained motionless, I heard a second thought emerge, more subtle but more powerful. What if he's wrong? That simple question was the beginning of an internal transformation. I began to reconsider everything: my preparation, my capabilities, what I truly knew about the client, the project, and the value I could deliver. And, little by little, that initial pain gave way to something stronger: the desire to prove, not out of pride, but out of conviction, that yes, I was ready. After the initial impact, I realized that letting my emotions take over would be the mistake that would confirm my boss's accusation. He said I wasn't ready, and losing my emotional control at that moment would be justifying that judgment. So, silently, I did what needed to be done. I took a deep breath, maintained my composure, and refocused. But controlling emotion isn't the same as ignoring it. Inside, I was dealing with a whirlwind. Wounded pride, shame, anger, all these feelings were there pulsing, yet I knew that if I didn't organize my mind, I wouldn't be able to think clearly, and clarity was all I needed at that moment. I mentally revisited each point of the proposal I had prepared. I recalled the data I'd collected, the strategic questions I'd planned to ask the client, and the real-world examples that would demonstrate the value of our solution. Even without the official authority to lead the meeting, I was ready to enter the right moment. The key was not letting emotion guide my actions. I didn't need to prove anything by shouting, nor act impulsively to regain prestige in front of my colleagues. What I needed was an opportunity. Just one, and I knew it would come. Because in the corporate world, what truly speaks loudest are results, and I was determined to deliver that. Long before that meeting, there were weeks of preparation, long hours that no one witnessed. While some saw the task as just another step in the sales process, I saw it as a real opportunity to prove my worth. I studied the client's market, read reports, analyzed competitors, and deeply understood their pain points. I didn't limit myself to what was in the briefing. I went beyond. I made discreet calls to industry contacts, studied how similar companies they've dealt with the same challenges, and even created simulations of how our product would be used in their real-life scenarios. I created slides to complement the official presentation, with specific data that could be used if more technical questions arose, which, by the way, I knew was quite likely. While some team members relied solely on the strength of the brand, or the leader's charisma, I was investing in precision, in personalization, in a tailored approach. But all of this was done in silence. I didn't share all the details of what I was doing, partly out of focus, partly because, deep down, I knew no one expected much of me at that moment. And precisely because of this, my preparation became even more valuable. I had something most people didn't: a real command of the client and the proposal. I knew exactly where we could be helpful, and, most importantly, I could recognize the signs of hesitation the client might show during the conversation. I wasn't just another participant in the meeting. I prepared myself to be the person who would understand, connect, and convince. The meeting began a few minutes after that embarrassing episode. The client entered the room, was formally welcomed, and the official presentation began, led by my boss and another colleague. For now, I was just part of the background, still under the shadow of the discrediting comment. I sat a little further back, observing, but something was different about me. I no longer carried the weight of judgment. My confidence didn't come from my title, nor my position, and at that moment, much less from my superior's approval. It came from my preparation. I knew, with a silent conviction, that I was ready even if they hadn't given me the space for the first few minutes. I remained attentive. I observed the client's body language, took note of the questions that arose, and their reactions to each slide, and I noticed something that went unnoticed by the others. The client was interested, but not completely convinced. There was a lack of connection. There was a lack of depth. They wanted more than a generic speech. Then the opportunity arose. At one point, the client asked a specific question about how our solution could adapt to a particular operational need of their business, something I had studied in detail. There was a brief silence, followed by a vague answer from my colleague. The client didn't seem satisfied. Without thinking twice, I raised my hand and asked permission to add. My boss hesitated for a moment, visibly surprised, but relented. I spoke clearly, precisely, without rambling, just delivering exactly what the client needed to hear. Data-driven arguments, real examples from other similar projects, and a personalized proposal no one else had prepared. At that moment, the tone of the meeting changed. The client's eyes turned to me. For the first time, I wasn't a supporting character. I was the bridge between their problem and the solution we were offering. After my intervention, the atmosphere changed. The client, previously mildly interested, now demonstrated genuine engagement. He began directing questions directly to me. I didn't force myself to be the center of attention. I didn't overtake anyone. I simply responded confidently, always, offering answers anchored in data, logic, and, above all, context. I realized that clients didn't want to be convinced with sense. He wanted to be understood. And that's when the negotiation began to take shape. I started asking questions not to waste time or appear clever, but to deeply understand what he expected from a partner like us. I listened carefully to each answer, and from there I constructed arguments tailored precisely to his needs. I took a consultative approach. I showed how our solution wasn't just another tool, but an extension of his company's strategy. I made connections between the demands mentioned in the meeting and specific features that addressed each of them. When he raised objections, I had already mapped out almost all of them, and most importantly, I had real, applicable, and straightforward answers. While all this was happening, my boss and the other team members seemed stunned. They didn't interrupt me, didn't argue. They were watching the client advance in the conversation, ask more questions, smile, and, most importantly, nod in approval. There was no longer any doubt about who was leading the moment. The negotiation ceased to be an institutional presentation and became a strategic conversation, with the client at the center and me at their side, leading with empathy, preparation, and vision. With each passing minute, the decision to close with our company seemed closer, and most ironically of all, the one leading this turnaround was the very one who just minutes before wasn't ready for the meeting. There's a moment in every negotiation when something changes. It's not a specific phrase or an obvious gesture, a subtle combination of signals. The tone of voice softens, the arms uncross, the posture leans forward. And that's exactly what I noticed on the client's side. He no longer spoke like someone being persuaded, but like someone already projecting the afterward. He began using future tense phrases like, when we are with you, or we will need to align this in the first week of implementation. The language has changed, and with it, the game has changed. I didn't celebrate, not yet. I maintained my composure, remained firm, listening, adjusting, reinforcing points with precision. But deep down, I knew the decision had already been made. The client was convinced, and not by chance. He was convinced because he felt safe, because he was understood, and because he found answers where before there had been only vague promises. This moment was silent, but powerful, because it not only marked the turning point in the negotiation, but also marked the instant my credibility until then questioned was rebuilt before everyone's eyes, including my boss. That the energy in the room was different. The client was now laughing, speaking naturally, exchanging glances with his partners as if they were already mentally moving forward to the next steps, and I could only think of one thing: see it through. This isn't the time to prove anything to anyone. Just finish what you started. The meeting was drawing to a close, but there was a quiet tension in the air, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that precedes an important decision. The client was already convinced, but it needed to be formalized. The definitive yes was missing. It was then that he said, "Can you send me the contract today? I want to move this up." At that moment, the air left everyone in the room, including mine. The silence was broken by a restrained, almost embarrassed smile from my boss. The colleagues around me exchanged glances. No one expected that deal to be sealed there, least of all by me. And, perhaps most symbolic, no one expected the turnaround to come from the very person who had been overruled just minutes before. I nodded naturally, as if it were just another step in the process. Even with my heart racing, I replied that we'd already left a draft ready, precisely to expedite the process, and that I'd personally handle the submission. The client smiled, pleased with the speed and attention to detail. Everything sounded professional, efficient and, above all, under control. At that point, there was no longer any room for doubt. Trust had been transferred. The meeting didn't just end with a contract being handed down, it ended with the authority of the conversation clearly shifting, and I felt this not as a stroke of luck but as the direct result of what I had prepared with discipline, executed with strategy, and conducted with respect. As the final thanks were given, and everyone stood to say goodbye, I could see something between surprise and admiration in some of my colleagues' eyes, and in my boss's eyes, a mix of pride and discomfort. He knew what he'd said, and now, faced with the result, there wasn't much to say. The deal was done, and everyone saw who did it. As soon as the meeting ended and the client left satisfied, the mood in the room changed dramatically. The initial tension gave way to a mixture of surprise, respect, and, in some cases, even a hint of disbelief. My colleagues who minutes before had looked at me with reservation or doubt, now looked at me as if I had just revealed a new level of competence. My boss, for his part, was silent for a moment. It was clear he was processing what had happened. That harsh sentence he'd uttered at the beginning of the meeting seemed to have been swallowed by the clear evidence of the outcome. The contract was closed, and I had been a key player in that. He approached and more reservedly said something like a good job, without the stiffness he'd had before. It was a moment of veiled but important recognition. There was no grand celebration or exchange of praise in front of the team, but the respect I felt from that change in attitude spoke louder than any words. My colleagues began seeking me out to understand how I had done it, what arguments had, what worked, what the secret was. And, more than that, the space for my participation grew. This reaction demonstrated that, despite the exposure and initial discomfort, results carry immense weight in the professional environment. They speak louder than harsh words or hasty judgments, and that sometimes best response is to act competently and let the facts prove their worth. This experience was undoubtedly a turning point in my career. I learned that isn't something that depends on the immediate approval of others, especially when that approval comes in a negative or public form. True confidence is born from preparation, deep knowledge, and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. I also understood that leadership isn't a title or a hierarchical position, but the ability to take the lead at the right time, influence, with clarity, and led by example. Even without the direct support of my boss, I was able to take responsibility and demonstrate value because I was ready. Furthermore, I learned that criticism, even harsh and misplaced, can fuel growth as long as you know how to filter what truly matters and use that energy to improve. And that professional respect is earned through results and demeanor, not through justifications or reactive defenses. Ultimately, this situation showed me that, in professional life, moments of pressure and exposure are inevitable, but how we react to them defines our trajectory. Closing that deal wasn't just a commercial victory, it was a personal victory. Proof that, even when doubted, it's possible to turn things around with courage, focus, and determination.